On May 7, 1945, at 1823 hours, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. stood in the map room of his headquarters in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, staring at a red line drawn across his operational chart. The line ran north to south through the center of Germany, cutting through towns his Third Army could reach in 48 hours. On the eastern side of that line sat Berlin, 120 miles away. Patton's lead elements were closer to the German capital than any Soviet unit. His tanks had fuel. His men were rested. The road to Berlin was open. But Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had just sent a message that made Patton's hands shake with rage. The message was 3 words long: hold present positions. Patton had spent 11 months fighting across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. His Third Army had liberated more territory, captured more enemy soldiers, and advanced farther than any other Allied army in Western Europe. From the breakout at Normandy in August 1944 to the drive across the Rhine in March 1945, Patton's forces had moved with a speed and aggression that German commanders called unnatural. They had relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. They had crossed the Rhine River before Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. They had cut through the Wehrmacht's remaining defenses like a blowtorch through ice. And now, with Berlin within reach and the war in its final hours, someone at Supreme Headquarters had decided that Patton's Third Army would not take the German capital. The order did not come from German resistance. It did not come from lack of fuel or ammunition. It came from Allied politics. And it would reshape Europe for the next 46 years. To understand why Patton was stopped 120 miles from Berlin, you have to understand what happened in the 11 months before that red line appeared on his map. You have to understand the battles Patton fought, the speed his army achieved, and the enemies he made not in Berlin, but in London and Washington. This is not a story about military failure. This is a story about a general who won every battle and lost the war's final objective because the men who gave him orders feared what he would do after the shooting stopped. If you want to see how one decision made in April 1945 changed the shape of modern Europe and the course of the Cold War, hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people who need to understand how history actually happened. And subscribe if you haven't already. We are pulling these forgotten stories out of the archives every single day. Back to Patton and the order that stopped him. The story begins not in May 1945, but in August 1944, in the hedgerow country of Normandy, France. By early August, Allied forces had been fighting in Normandy for 2 months since the D-Day landings on June 6th. The fighting had been brutal. The Germans had fortified every field, every road, every village. American, British, and Canadian forces were making progress, but it was measured in yards, not miles. Casualties were heavy. The breakout everyone had expected after D-Day had not happened. Then, on August 1st, 1944, General Omar Bradley activated the U.S. Third Army under the command of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton had been sidelined for nearly a year after slapping 2 soldiers in Sicily. Eisenhower had kept him in England as a decoy, using his reputation to convince the Germans that the real invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. But now, with the Normandy beachhead secure and the Boke-Edge country beginning to open up, Eisenhower needed Patton's aggression. Patton's mission was simple: exploit the gap created by Operation Cobra, Bradley's breakthrough offensive south of Saint-El, drive east, cut off German forces in Brittany, then wheel northeast toward Paris and the German border. Patton took command on August 1st. By August 10th, his Third Army had advanced 60 miles, captured 20,000 German prisoners, and reached the outskirts of Le Mans. The German commanders in France could not believe what they were seeing. American armor was supposed to move cautiously, consolidating gains, waiting for infantry support. Patton's tanks did not wait for anything. They drove through the night. They bypassed German strongpoints. They refueled on the move and kept rolling. German units that were preparing defensive positions would wake up to find American tanks already behind them. Patton's staff officers called it reconnaissance in force. The Germans called it chaos. Between August 1st and August 31st, 1944, Patton's Third Army advanced over 400 miles. They liberated most of Brittany, captured Le Mans, closed the Falaise pocket where 50,000 German soldiers were trapped, crossed the Seine River, and drove toward the German border. No army in modern military history had moved that fast across enemy territory while maintaining offensive capability. The Third Army was consuming 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. Patton's quartermasters were improvising supply lines that stretched back 300 miles to the Normandy beaches. But the fuel kept coming, and the tanks kept moving. By September 1st, Patton's forward elements had reached the Moselle River, 40 miles from the German border. Berlin was 500 miles to the northeast. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. German commanders were sending desperate reports to Berlin, saying that no defensive line could hold against the American Third Army. And then the fuel stopped. On September 2nd, 1944, Patton received orders from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Due to supply constraints, all fuel and ammunition deliveries to the Third Army were being diverted north to support Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Montgomery was planning Operation Market Garden, an ambitious airborne assault designed to capture bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands and open a direct route into northern Germany. Eisenhower had decided that Montgomery's northern thrust would receive priority for all available resources. Patton's Third Army would hold its current positions along the Moselle until supplies could be redistributed. Patton was ordered to stop. Patton did not stop. He ignored the order and continued attacking across the Moselle River with whatever fuel his supply officers could scrounge from abandoned German vehicles and sympathetic American units. His tanks rolled on fumes. His infantry walked when trucks ran out of gas. But they kept moving. By September 12th, Patton's forces had established bridgeheads across the Moselle and were preparing to assault the fortified city of Metz. Then the fuel situation became critical. Patton's tanks were literally running dry in the middle of combat operations. On September 15th, he was forced to halt offensive operations. His Third Army sat on the Moselle River, within striking distance of the German border, while thousands of gallons of fuel were being delivered 200 miles north to support Montgomery's operation. Operation Market Garden was launched on September 17, 1944. It was a disaster. The airborne assault failed to capture the bridge at Arnhem. Montgomery's ground forces could not link up with the paratroopers. Over 8,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The operation achieved none of its objectives and consumed the fuel and supplies that could have kept Patton moving toward Germany. Patton later wrote in his diary that if he had been given the fuel allocated to Market Garden, his Third Army would have been across the Rhine and into Germany by October 1st. Whether that was true is debatable. What is not debatable is that Patton's advance was stopped not by the Germans, but by Allied supply policy. The Third Army resumed offensive operations in November 1944. The fighting was brutal. The Germans had used the 2-month pause to fortify the Siegfried Line, the belt of bunkers and obstacles that ran along Germany's western border. Patton's forces fought through rain, mud, and entrenched defenders. They captured Metz on November 22nd after a month-long siege. They crossed into Germany in early December. And then, on December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last major offensive of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. The German attack hit the U.S. First Army in the Ardennes forest, creating a bulge in the Allied line that threatened to split the American forces in two. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19th. The situation was critical. The Germans had broken through on a 50-mile front. American units were surrounded at Bastogne. Reinforcements were needed immediately. Eisenhower asked his commanders how quickly they could respond. Patton said he could disengage 3 divisions from the Third Army's front, wheel them 90 degrees north, and attack the southern flank of the German penetration within 48 hours. The other generals in the room thought Patton was joking. You could not disengage 3 divisions in the middle of combat operations, move them 100 miles in winter weather, and launch a coordinated attack in 48 hours. Patton was not joking. On December 22nd, 72 hours after the meeting at Verdun, Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed into the German lines south of Bastogne. By December 26th, they had broken through and relieved the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. Patton had done exactly what he said he would do. The maneuver is still studied in military academies as one of the most impressive examples of operational flexibility in modern warfare. But it also revealed something that made Eisenhower and Bradley deeply uncomfortable. Patton could move his army faster and more aggressively than any other Allied commander. And that made him unpredictable. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945. The Germans had failed to split the Allied forces or recapture Antwerp. They had suffered 100,000 casualties and lost most of their remaining armor. The Wehrmacht was broken. The Allies prepared for the final push into Germany. Montgomery planned a massive set-piece assault across the Rhine in the north. Bradley's 12th Army Group would cross in the center. Patton's 3rd Army would support from the south. That was the plan. Patton had other ideas. On the night of March 22, 1945, elements of Patton's 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine River near Oppenheim using assault boats. They did it without air support, without a massive artillery barrage, and without asking permission from Supreme Headquarters. By dawn on March 23rd, Patton had a full division across the Rhine and was expanding the bridgehead. He called Bradley and said 6 words that became legendary in the Third Army. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Montgomery's massive Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder, was scheduled to begin that same morning with 25,000 paratroopers, 3,000 artillery pieces, and weeks of planning. Patton had beaten him across by 10 hours using assault boats and sheer audacity. Once across the Rhine, Patton's Third Army moved faster than it had in France. German resistance was collapsing. Entire Wehrmacht divisions were surrendering without a fight. Patton's tanks were advancing 30 to 40 miles per day. They liberated prisoner-of-war camps, overran SS headquarters, and captured German industrial centers. By mid-April, the Third Army had driven 200 miles into Germany. They had reached Czechoslovakia. They were approaching the Elbe River, the agreed-upon demarcation line where American and Soviet forces would meet, and Berlin was 120 miles to the northeast. Patton requested permission to continue the advance. His staff had drawn up plans for a rapid thrust toward Berlin. The city was lightly defended. Most of the German forces remaining in the east were focused on the Soviet advance from Poland. American intelligence estimated that Patton's armored spearheads could reach the outskirts of Berlin in 3 days. Patton sent the plan to Bradley. Bradley forwarded it to Eisenhower. Eisenhower said no. The decision not to take Berlin was not made in April 1945. It was made months earlier, at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had met in Crimea to discuss the post-war occupation of Germany. Stalin had demanded that the Soviet Union be allowed to capture Berlin. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed. The reasoning was political, not military. The Soviet Union had suffered over 20 million casualties fighting Germany. Stalin wanted Berlin as proof that the Red Army had won the war in Europe. Roosevelt and Churchill did not want to jeopardize post-war cooperation with the Soviets by racing them to Berlin. So they agreed that Berlin would fall within the Soviet zone of occupation. The military commanders were not consulted. When Eisenhower received Patton's request to advance on Berlin, he was bound by the agreements made at Yalta. He was also bound by his own strategic assessment. Eisenhower believed that capturing Berlin would cost 100,000 American casualties. He did not believe the city had military value. The German government was collapsing. Hitler was trapped in his bunker. The war would end whether the Americans took Berlin or the Soviets did. Eisenhower decided that American lives should not be spent on a symbolic objective. On April 15, 1945, he sent a message to the Soviet High Command informing them that Allied forces would halt at the Elbe River and allow the Red Army to take Berlin. Patton was not informed of the Yalta agreements. He was not told that Berlin had been promised to the Soviets. He was simply ordered to halt at the Elbe. When he received the order, he assumed it was temporary. He continued moving his forces into position for a final advance. On April 25th, American and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River. The link-up was celebrated with handshakes and toasts. Patton was not there. He was 120 miles to the south, repositioning his Third Army for what he believed would be the final push. Then, on May 7th, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Patton's Third Army never crossed the Elbe. They never attacked Berlin. The red line on Patton's map became permanent. What Patton did not know, and what would only become clear in the months after the war, was that Eisenhower's decision was not just about avoiding casualties or honoring agreements with Stalin. It was also about Patton himself. Eisenhower and his staff were deeply concerned about what Patton would do if he reached Berlin first. Patton had made his views on the Soviet Union very clear. He believed that the Soviets were a greater long-term threat than Germany. He had stated publicly that the United States should ally with the remnants of the Wehrmacht and attack the Red Army before they consolidated control over Eastern Europe. He called the Soviets barbarians. He said the real war would begin after Germany surrendered. Eisenhower knew that if Patton reached Berlin, there was a real possibility that he would provoke a confrontation with Soviet forces. Patton might refuse to withdraw. He might occupy territory beyond the agreed zones. He might create an incident that would destroy the fragile alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union. Eisenhower could not take that risk. So he stopped Patton 120 miles from Berlin and made sure that the Soviet Red Army reached the German capital first. The decision was not about military capability. It was about political control. And it worked. The Soviets took Berlin in late April 1945 after a brutal two-week battle that cost them 80,000 dead and 280,000 wounded. They raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag on May 2nd. When Germany surrendered on May 7th, Berlin was firmly in Soviet hands. The city was divided into occupation zones, but the Soviets controlled access. Within months, they began consolidating power in eastern Germany. By 1949, Germany was split into two nations, East and West. Berlin became the focal point of the Cold War. The division lasted 46 years. Patton never accepted the decision. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, he became increasingly vocal about his belief that the United States had made a catastrophic mistake. He argued that American forces should have taken Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. He said that stopping at the Elbe had handed Eastern Europe to Stalin. He advocated for a preemptive war against the Soviet Union while American forces were still mobilized and the Soviets were exhausted. His statements created a firestorm. The press called him reckless. Politicians demanded his removal. Eisenhower reassigned him to command a paper army in Bavaria. On December 9, 1945, Patton was seriously injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. Some historians believe the accident was not an accident. There is no conclusive evidence either way. What is certain is that Patton died believing that he had been stopped from winning the peace after winning the war. The question of whether Patton should have been allowed to advance on Berlin has been debated for 80 years. Military historians argue both sides. Those who support Eisenhower's decision point to several factors. First, the Yalta agreements were binding. Roosevelt and Churchill had promised Stalin that Berlin would be in the Soviet zone. Breaking that promise would have destroyed Allied unity at a critical moment. Second, the casualties would have been significant. Berlin was a city of 4 million people with extensive fortifications. Even with light German resistance, street fighting would have been brutal. Eisenhower's estimate of 100,000 casualties was not unreasonable. Third, Berlin had no strategic value. The German government was collapsing. Capturing the city would not have shortened the war or changed the outcome. It would have been a symbolic victory purchased with American lives. Those who argue that Patton should have been allowed to advance point to different factors. First, the Yalta agreements were made without understanding the true intentions of the Soviet Union. By April 1945, it was becoming clear that Stalin had no intention of allowing free elections in Poland or respecting the sovereignty of Eastern European nations. If American forces had reached Berlin first, the post-war negotiations would have been conducted from a position of strength, not weakness. Second, Patton's advance would not have cost 100,000 casualties. His Third Army was not planning a frontal assault on Berlin. They would have encircled the city, cut off remaining German forces, and negotiated a surrender. The brutal street fighting that the Soviets experienced was the result of Soviet tactics, not the inherent difficulty of capturing the city. Third, Berlin had immense political value. The capital of Nazi Germany was the ultimate symbol of victory. Whoever controlled Berlin would control the narrative of how the war ended and who won it. But the debate over military strategy misses the deeper issue. The decision to stop Patton was not made because Eisenhower believed the Soviets could take Berlin more efficiently. It was made because Eisenhower and the political leadership in Washington and London had decided that maintaining the alliance with Stalin was more important than territorial gains in Germany. They believed that post-war cooperation with the Soviet Union was essential for creating a stable peace. They believed that the United Nations could manage disputes between the Allies. They believed that Stalin could be trusted to honor his commitments. They were wrong about all of it. Within 2 years of Germany's surrender, the wartime alliance had collapsed. Stalin imposed communist governments across Eastern Europe. He blockaded Berlin in 1948, forcing the United States to organize the Berlin Airlift. He supported communist movements in Greece, Turkey, and Korea. The Cold War began not because of anything the Western Allies did after the war, but because Stalin had always intended to dominate Eastern Europe. The Yalta agreements did not create cooperation. They created the conditions for 46 years of division, and the decision to stop Patton at the Elbe meant that when the division came, the line ran through the heart of Germany. It is impossible to know what would have happened if Patton had been allowed to advance on Berlin. Would the Cold War have been shorter? Would Eastern Europe have been spared Soviet domination? Would Germany have been reunified sooner? These are unanswerable questions. What is certain is that the decision changed the shape of Europe. The line drawn in April 1945 became the Iron Curtain. The territories conceded to Stalin became prison states for 2 generations. And the man who could have reached Berlin first was ordered to hold his position while history was decided by someone else. Patton understood what was happening. In his final months, he wrote extensively about the mistake he believed was being made. He argued that the United States had defeated the wrong enemy. He said that Germany, for all its crimes, was not the long-term threat to Western civilization. That threat was the Soviet Union, and it was being handed control of half of Europe by leaders who did not understand what they were doing. Patton's views were extreme. His proposed solution, a war against the Soviet Union in 1945, was unthinkable. The American public wanted demobilization, not another war. The soldiers wanted to go home. The idea of attacking an ally, even a problematic ally like Stalin, was politically impossible. But Patton's diagnosis of the problem was accurate. The Soviet Union was not going to be a partner in peace, and the decision to prioritize alliance unity over strategic positioning meant that when Stalin revealed his true intentions, the Western Allies had no leverage. The Third Army was deactivated in October 1945. Patton's staff officers returned to civilian life or were reassigned to occupation duties. The tanks that had rolled across France and Germany were mothballed or scrapped. The maps that showed Patton's proposed advance on Berlin were filed away in archives. For decades, they remained classified. When they were finally released, they showed what Patton had been planning. His Third Army would have crossed the Elbe on April 20th. They would have bypassed German resistance and driven straight for the Berlin suburbs. Forward elements would have reached the city by April 23rd. The bulk of the Third Army would have arrived by April 25th. Soviet forces did not enter Berlin until April 21st and did not reach the city center until April 26th. If Patton had been allowed to move, American forces would have arrived first. But the maps also showed something else. Patton was not planning to stop at Berlin. His staff had marked objectives beyond the city: Dresden, Prague, Vienna. Patton intended to keep moving until he controlled a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic. He was not planning to occupy Germany. He was planning to occupy Eastern Europe. That was why Eisenhower stopped him. Not because Berlin was too costly, but because Patton's ambitions went far beyond what the political leadership had authorized. Patton was fighting a different war than the one his superiors had agreed to, and in a coalition conflict where political objectives outweighed military ones, that made him dangerous. The decision to stop Patton reflects a fundamental tension in American military history. The United States has always struggled with the relationship between military victory and political objectives. Generals are trained to win battles. Politicians are responsible for winning the peace. When those two goals align, the results are decisive and lasting. When they diverge, the results are messy and contentious. In April 1945, Patton believed that winning the peace required controlling Berlin and denying Stalin a foothold in Central Europe. Eisenhower and Roosevelt believed that winning the peace required maintaining the alliance with Stalin and avoiding unnecessary casualties. Both men were acting on their understanding of the situation. Both men believed they were making the right decision. History suggests that Patton was correct about Stalin's intentions, but Eisenhower was correct about the limits of American power in 1945. The argument that the United States should have taken Berlin assumes that American forces could have held it against Soviet objections. That assumption is questionable. By May 1945, the Red Army had 12 million men under arms. They controlled territory from Poland to the Elbe. Their supply line ran back to the Soviet Union, and they had no domestic political pressure to demobilize. The United States had 8 million men under arms, but most of them were scheduled for demobilization or redeployment to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. American supply lines ran back across the Atlantic, and the American public was exhausted by war. If the United States had occupied Berlin and Stalin had demanded its withdrawal, the United States would have faced a choice: start another war against a fresh enemy, or negotiate. Negotiation would have led to the same outcome as the Yalta agreements: withdraw. War would have been politically impossible. That reality shaped Eisenhower's decision. He understood that occupying Berlin would create a crisis that the United States was not prepared to manage. Better to accept the agreed zones, consolidate control over Western Germany, and hope that Stalin would honor the Yalta commitments. When Stalin violated those commitments, the United States responded with the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the formation of NATO. Those policies contained Soviet expansion and created the conditions for eventual victory in the Cold War. But they did not undo the division of Germany or the domination of Eastern Europe. Those consequences were locked in when the decision was made to stop at the Elbe. Patton never saw the Cold War. He died 7 months after Germany surrendered. But his warnings about Soviet intentions proved prophetic. Within a year of his death, Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union had consolidated control over Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Within 4 years, Germany was divided and Berlin was blockaded. Within 5 years, the Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb, and the Cold War was fully underway. Everything Patton had predicted came true. And the decision to stop his advance on Berlin meant that when it did, the Western Allies were negotiating from a position of weakness, not strength. There is a final irony to the story. The officer who stopped Patton from advancing on Berlin was Dwight Eisenhower, the same man who, as President of the United States in the 1950s, would authorize covert operations, military buildups, and aggressive containment policies designed to counter Soviet expansion. The same man who would warn about the dangers of Soviet communism and the need for American military readiness. The same man who, in his farewell address, would caution against the military-industrial complex while acknowledging the ongoing threat from the Soviet Union. Eisenhower spent the rest of his life managing the consequences of the decision he made in April 1945. Whether he believed it was the right decision is unknown. He never publicly second-guessed it. But he also never denied that Patton had been correct about Stalin. The story of why Patton was refused the advance on Berlin is not a story about military tactics or operational planning. It is a story about the limits of military power in achieving political objectives. Patton won every battle he fought. His Third Army was the most effective offensive force in the European theater. But winning battles does not determine the outcome of wars. That is determined by politicians making decisions about what the military is allowed to do and where it is allowed to go. In April 1945, the politicians decided that the symbolic and political value of Berlin was not worth the risk of confrontation with the Soviet Union. They drew a red line on a map and ordered Patton to stop. He stopped. And Europe was divided for the next 46 years. If this story changed the way you think about World War II and the decisions that shaped the modern world, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to understand how history actually happened. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives every single day. Real history, real decisions, real consequences. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Poland, anywhere. Our community stretches across the world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your thoughts. Do you think Patton should have been allowed to advance? Would it have changed the Cold War? Let us know. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure that the decisions made in 1945 are not forgotten. These moments shape the world we live in today, and you are helping make sure people remember how it happened.